Welcome to Talking History, a series of talks from the Farnham U3A World History, Ancient, Medieval and Modern group. Please note, the views expressed in this talk are representative of the views held at the time of the material being discussed. They do not necessarily represent the views of the speaker. The Farnham U3A World History, Ancient, Medieval and Modern group, nor the team at the Mr. T podcast studio. How Science is Helping to People Our Past. A talk by Pam Taylor, where she tells us that archaeology is not all about grubbing around in the dirt.
I thought of this talk because we don't often have much about archaeology, and it's not all grubbing around in the dirt. There is a lot of grubbing around in the dirt. I don't do it, but we're going to be looking at the results of grubbing around in the dirt. Archaeology is not an ancient craft, but one that has developed over the last few centuries, going from antiquarian interest to one involving many scientific techniques today. My interest began in the 70s, when I joined first an evening class at Farnborough Tech and then an Royal Aircraft Establishment Archaeological Society, active in digging local sites. At that time, the use of science was limited to carbon-14 dating, which was very expensive for a local society, but gave a date for organic material, that is, material that's grown, so trees, people, animals and so on. And also X-radiation techniques, which were sometimes used, for example, on Egyptian mummies. Dating had previously been done largely by stratification, how deep an object was in a sequence. This meant finding undisturbed layers of deposition, and that was not always the case. Artifacts could then be dated by type in the sequence, for example, types of pottery. This, as you can imagine, was open to all sorts of misinterpretation due to local preferences and fashions, but found its uses, particularly on Roman sites, as they tended to be more standardised. But during the 70s and 80s, there was an explosion in the non-invasive medical imaging field. With the invention of MRI scanning, at first that was called nuclear magnetic resonance imaging, and people didn't like the nuclear bit, so they changed it to MRI. So MRI scanning and CT scannings, etc. Archaeologists began to realise that these methods could produce much more thorough analysis of human remains than had been possible before. DNA analysis was to further revolutionise this. A very recent find that I'll just mention here is that of the casts of footprints belonging to early humans in Larache, northwest Morocco. They've been finding quite a lot in Morocco recently. Thought to number at least 5 individuals of differing ages, they could have been foraging for seafood. Buried for many years, the prints have been gradually uncovered recently. The prints are thought to be 90,000 years old, so it could be very early Homo sapiens. So watch this space on that one. I'm going to start with some remarkable artefacts from our very distant past. I found these in the museum at Amman in Jordan. We had had a very interesting 3 weeks travelling around first Syria and then in Jordan, and I was a little jaded by this time. At the museum, I wandered round, only focusing on items that seemed unusual to me. I was stopped in my tracks by a group of objects that gave a wonderful feeling of the people who made them. First was a human statue, formed by plastering white clay over a bundle of twigs. Not fired, it was technically not pottery, belonging to the pre-ceramic Neolithic, 8 to 6,000 years old. It came from Ain Ghazal, and there was another one with it, a whole figure this time, and I don't know who she was, but she was standing in exactly the same pose. Beside them was a skull. Given new life, or commemorating someone who had died, several of these were discovered by the archaeologist Kathleen Kenyon at Jericho and elsewhere. The skulls were discovered placed either in rooms that were used, so in the corner, or beneath floorings, not buried as part of the body. All of these are thought to have been used to continue remembrance of the people by their families or communities. And they have done a reconstruction of one of them. Although not as true to life as the reconstruction, they give a much more realistic impression than a bare skeleton would. So let's look at an example where science can give insights into a particular person's life. That of Ötzi, the so-called glacier mummy. The body was found by two walkers next to a retreating glacier. At first, the body was thought to be an accident victim from about the 1930s. Subsequently, the date of death was pushed back, first by centuries and then by millennia. Finally, the date was established by carbon-14 dating to 5,300 years ago, about 3,300 BC, in the European Neolithic or Stone Age. But just at the end of that Stone Age, quite crucially. So how does carbon-14 dating work? I hope that I'm not insulting any of you by starting with an atom. All substances are made of building blocks called atoms. There are 92 naturally occurring types, some of which are radioactive. The nucleus, the important bit in a lot of ways, because it tells you what atom it is. Now, this contains neutrons, which have no charge, and protons, which has a positive charge, but they both have mass. And then around it, circling like the planets, are the negatively charged electrons. In an uncharged atom, there's the same number of electrons as there are protons, so charges balance out. That's the model that has been built up over many, many years by scientists. It's not been superseded yet. It's a very simplified version of it. It is thought to be, from experiment, how atoms must be composed. They are very, very small atoms. So if you imagine a millimetre, can you all imagine a millimetre in your mind on a ruler? Well, there are 1 million in a millimetre. Okay, so that's the structure of an atom. And then the carbon atom, which has 6 protons, so we call it carbon-6, and then 12 because it has 6 neutrons also making up some mass. So carbon-6-12 is the normal version of the carbon atom. It is neutral and it's not radioactive. But in the atmosphere, the sun's energy can cause something to become carbon-14, called an isotope of carbon. So carbon-14 will have 6 protons and it will have 8 neutrons. We have the so-called carbon cycle, and the carbon-14 then is taken up with any carbon by plants, by the green stuff, and then the animals will eat the green stuff. The ratio of carbon-14 to normal carbon-12 is constant in living organisms while they're alive. But once the organism has died, the carbon-14 suffers radioactive decay, causing that ratio to decrease at a known rate. The carbon-12 and carbon-14 differ slightly in mass, so they can be separated in a mass spectrometer. The atoms at the end are ionized, that is, they become charged, and when sent into a magnetic field, the lighter carbon-12 move in a smaller circle than the heavier carbon-14, which can be caught on a screen. And if anybody's interested in the physics of it, that's the motor principle in action. So measuring the ratio when discovered allows a date to be calculated for the time of death. Okay, the actual procedure has been continually refined since first used to account for the environment, diet, etc. So back to our glacier mummy. Ötzi was found in a remarkable state of preservation. It's thought that it snowed deeply soon after he died, and that he remained frozen until the glacier started melting recently. Examination revealed that he had shoulder-length hair, a beard, and several tattoos, including what are considered by some to be the acupuncture points, which is an interesting idea. His teeth were worn, but free from caries, initially thought to be about 25. Later bone analysis showed that he was about 45. His clothing was remarkably similar to that worn by a modern mountaineer, including boots with leather straps making grooves for purchase in the snow. His trousers were interesting. consisting of separate legs made of goat skin attached to a belt, similar to Native Americans today. He carried a range of belongings, including a retoucheur with a concealed blade, and it looks to me like a Stanley knife, and a flint dagger. Later research showed that the dagger had been recently resharpened and that Ötzi was right-handed. A CT scan showed calcified plaque in his arteries, indicating that he suffered from atherosclerosis. There were lots more fascinating facts discovered, including that he had a copper axe. Smelting of copper was just reaching the Alps region during Ötzi's lifetime, despite it having been carried out in the Near East for a couple of millennia. We always were slow in Western Europe. Where did Ötzi come from? 3 sources were used to identify this: the pollen in his stomach, the wooden objects, and his tooth enamel. The last method involved analysing minerals found in his teeth and comparing it with water samples from the area, and we'll be seeing that in later examples as well. All pointed to an origin in the Eisack Valley, South Tyrol. But one answer took 10 years to be decided. How did he die? Further CT scans and X-rays showed a small skin wound made by an arrow, which went unnoticed really for a long time. He probably pulled out the rest of the arrow himself, but the arrowhead remained lodged in his rib cage, 15 millimetres from his lung. Presumably Ötzi bled to death alone on the mountain. One thing that puzzles me is why he was shot. If it was robbery, why leave valuable resources there, including the newfangled copper axe? The motive for the killing is something that science can't tell us, yet, maybe never. However, Ötzi was one of the first to have his whole genome sequenced and recorded for future research purposes. Richard III was the first individual whose identity is known to be sequenced. Which brings us to the other big breakthrough for archaeology, that of DNA sequencing, in particular the technique of reading an ancient DNA, so-called aDNA. But first, some more science. A basic animal cell, we have something called a nucleus, which is a bit of an awkward thing, isn't it? We have a nucleus in an atom, and we have a nucleus in a cell, but the nucleus in the cell is much, much bigger than the nucleus in the atom. But anyway, that's the nucleus, and that contains the DNA, the chromosomes, the genes, and so on. We've got the cytoplasm round, the sort of jelly sort of stuff, and the energy factories, the mitochondrion, which are important. Okay, you might have heard the words mitochondrial DNA, and that will be stored in mitochondria. So, following the ideas of Charles Darwin, our hero of today, and Gregor Mendel, ideas about inherited characteristics began to be studied in earnest, principally in Germany at first. Gradually, the idea of the chromosome and then genes, which carry information within the nucleus of the cell, developed, leading in the early 1950s to the structure of the double helix being demonstrated. It always puzzled me why it was called a double helix. I thought, well, it's just one spiral, but it's 2 parts, like a ladder that's been sort of... In the early 2000s, the human genome was sequenced for the first time, and since then, huge amounts of research has been carried out in many different areas. Looking at the structure of DNA, 4 types of nucleotide bases form the strands of the double helix. In the double helix, we have 4 different sorts, A, T, C, and G. They always occur as pairs across the strands, A with T and C with G. So if you separate the 2 sides of the ladder, so you've got one on either side, you can always match them up with another one of the same, because you know if you've got an A, you need a T. If you've got a T, you need an A, a C, and a G, and so on. A segment of the DNA, which codes for the cell's synthesis of a specific protein, is called a gene. And the genes present in a nucleus within a body are exactly the same in all cells throughout that body. However, mutations occur randomly over time. These mutations may spread within a population by a process of natural selection, and these can be studied to trace changes in populations through the ages. DNA can thus give individual information, for example, sex, eye colour and so on, and also information on a population level. Since 2000, DNA sampling and analysis has developed several different techniques. For example, mitochondrial DNA, which can be used to trace in the female line, as it was with Richard III. They traced the mitochondrial DNA through known females down to a female in this generation, who then they found her son. So that's how they did the tracing with Richard III. You can also have Y chromosomal testing, so that's the Y chromosome, which only the males carry, so that traces the male line. And autosomal testing is used for general research. Since methods of retrieving DNA from older specimens was achieved, so-called ancient DNA, there has been a lot of work done on museum collections from previous explorations, bringing to light tribal and familial relationships in a remarkable way. We'll look at some of these in more detail. The archaeological world has its fair share of areas of scholarly dispute. I've got those in inverted commas. They will call them scholarly. Sometimes they become quite skullduggery-ish. Many of them concerning periods of change. For example, the times when one culture, as shown by its material remains, changes to differing modes of life. This can happen over a short period of time, or maybe a much slower change. One of those, between the Roman period and the successor near-continental cultures, ranges back and forth between rival theories of conquest or largely peaceful settlement. New evidence is evinced on the side of one or the other, sometimes generating a fantastical, complicated structure beloved by some academics. I propose to look at one controversy that has been raging for some time, that of the huge transition from the largely agricultural Neolithic, based on the use of mainly flint implements, to that of the metal-using Bronze Age. Britain was relatively late in this change, some 2,000 years behind civilizations in the Near East. Indeed, the first metal to be used for implements was copper, and visitors to museums in the Near East will see many objects from their Copper Age. In fact, we saw that Ötzi carried a copper knife. In Britain, we went straight to the use of bronze, though much later, possibly because we had a ready supply of tin. Our first case in this section was the earliest person to be excavated who was carrying metal working equipment, the Amesbury archer, nicknamed the King of Stonehenge by no less an authority than the son, or it may have been the male. Excavated in May 2002, ahead of a housing development at Amesbury, he was accompanied by bell beakers, characteristic of early Bronze Age burial rites, particularly on the near continent, a fairly small area in Amesbury. The grave yielded the largest number of artefacts of a Bronze Age burial in Britain, including many arrowheads, hence his name, a flint knapping kit, and metalworking tools. So that's the boundary. So you've got the flint arrowheads, you've got flint knapping kit, and you've got metal working tools. So he's a real crossover man. No wonder he was nicknamed the King. Fascinatingly, he also had 2 boar's tusks, possibly to use in metalworking. Sadly, no fancy boar's tusk helmet like in Homer's Mycenae. There were also 2 gold ornaments, possibly for the hair, the oldest gold ornaments known from England. The archer was between 35 to 45 years old at death, and he had been buried with great respect. Isotope analysis of his teeth showed that he had not grown up near Stonehenge, but probably in the Western Alps. Now, Ötzi had been found in the Alps as well. Was he perhaps one of the first to bring the new technology to Britain? Certainly, no grave goods had been yet discovered with such a set of objects. Carbon-14 dating showed that he died in about 2300 BC. At that time, the site of Woodhenge had been a site of religious significance for some time, and the bluestones had been brought from Wales. Perhaps he was a pilgrim. But it gets even more intriguing, for nearby, a second burial was found. He was quickly dubbed the Companion. He was only in his early 20s at death, and was a slightly more recent burial. He had 2 gold hair rings, like the archer. Fascinatingly, both he and the archer shared a rare hereditary anomaly, a fusing of some foot bones, and so it was postulated that they were related. DNA analysis done later was to show that both had steppe ancestry from Western Asia, and that they were related. Possibly the companion was the great-grandson of the archer. The companion was born in the local area, however, but seems to have spent some time in the area where the archer grew up. Perhaps the family had maintained their continental links. As usual, the more we find out, the more we don't know. But his finding is commemorated by the village primary school, which is partly on the site of where he was found. So they will know a little bit about their local history. So we've found 2 people at the cusp of the huge transition from stone to metal. Are there others to find? People have often wondered about the builders of Stonehenge. There must have been countless such, as the stones were painstakingly brought to the site and then built and rebuilt several times, interestingly, just before this transition. A year after this discovery of the archer and his companions, archaeologists discovered another important burial nearby. This time it was a multiple burial of at least 9 individuals. This is more characteristic of Neolithic practices, as Bronze Age burials tend to be individual. The grave contained 5 adult males, several juveniles, and the cremated remains of an infant. The eldest man had been buried in a crouched position with the others scattered round him, their skulls resting at his feet. The contents included flint tools and a boar's tusk, like the archer. They also had flint arrowheads, hence the title bowmen. In fact, the tabloids, ever keen for a snappy title, named them the Band of Brothers. In the grave were surprisingly 8 bell beakers, an unusually high number. Bell beakers, always thought to be characteristic of early Bronze Age burials. It's worth mentioning that the term beaker burial came about through an original misunderstanding of their function. Archaeologists assumed that they were beakers, and therefore to use for drinking. However, they are now thought to be general-purpose ceramic vessels of distinctive form, but 8 is a lot. The presence of the beakers, a sign of links to the continent, was puzzling, especially when the oxygen isotope values for the teeth suggested that they were all from Wales. So it seemed that they had all been born and brought up in Wales to come to Stonehenge when a little over 6 years old. This didn't stop the sun running one of its muddle-headed pieces. Boozy beaker people who invaded the United Kingdom, and their blood still runs through us today. Well, perhaps that's where we got the boozy bit from. I just think, where to start? Where on earth were these people educated? Obviously, if the grave contained beakers, the men must have been on the equivalent of a drunken stag do. Obvious, isn't it? Accidentally annihilating the population in the process. I was unable to find DNA analysis for the bowmen, as they were nicknamed, but the men and the teenager all had similar shaped skulls, with distinctive Wormian bones between the parts of the skull, and I have to take this on trust because I have no idea what Wormian bones are, indicating a possible relationship between them. The grave was used for a period of about 25 to 50 years, and was of a similar era to that of the archer. Now, it was used for 25 to 50 years, and there was a quite considerable age range. They didn't all come at once. So that grave was opened, reburied, and so on over some time. So these men seem to have been part of a family or tribe from Wales who came to Stonehenge about the time of a major restructuring of the bluestones that have been traced to the Preseli Mountains in Wales. Anyway, they seem to have held onto some of their traditional burial rites, such as multiple burials, but to have incorporated the newfangled bell beakers. So again, more interesting things to puzzle and to think, well, nothing is actually standard in this life, is it? From just these graves, it would appear that the transition might have been peaceful. What does further research show? On the mainland of Britain, the beaker culture spread throughout, with the DNA showing a migration pattern of people from the continent, who originated in the steppe regions of the Black and Caspian Seas. This DNA was brought by men travelling into the regions, bringing metalworking practices with them. One area studied has bucked this trend, and a rather surprising one at that. The western seaboard has always been well inhabited. The people, far from being a backwater, people travelled by sea freely up and down from Iberia, Cornwall, Ireland, Wales and the west of Scotland. A fascinating study was carried out in Westray, one of the northernmost Orkney Islands, and we'll have a look at that. The site was excavated on the coast of Westray, called Knowltland Links, next to a golf course. The site is right on the coast. It's on the west of Westray, and it takes all the Atlantic and throughout it. It's a site that has been excavated because it's in peril. The huts that they excavated, and there was a cemetery, large middens, and middens are loved by archaeologists because they contain lots of detritus. They can tell you what they ate because they often contain lots of seashells and so on. The site was under threat as, having been covered and protected by sand dunes, the natural movement of the sand meant that the site was exposed and would be lost to the wind and sea before long. There was evidence of Neolithic dwellings there, so we're still in the Stone Age, similar to those at Skara Brae. And seemingly this mode of life was carried on well after the Bronze Age culture had spread to mainland Britain. The Bronze Age huts formed three slightly separate groups, perhaps extended families, and the distinction carried into the cemetery area. There were single and multiple burials, inhumations and cremations, and one large cist grave, that is, lined with big stones. DNA analysis was carried out on many of the occupants, and this gave a surprise. There was indeed plenty of migration evidence, but it was among the females rather than the males. So in mainland Britain it had been mostly the males. It would seem that the way of life remained largely unchanged due to the strong patriarchal society that had been built up over many generations. So this remote to us island community welcomed a considerable number of incoming women, not just from neighbouring islands and mainland Scotland, but with far more exotic ancestry. Whether these women had agency over the decision to move is an interesting one to ponder, but I think that would probably have been unlikely. The genome of the people of Knowltland retained its Neolithic male character for a further 1,000 years, so that's through the Y chromosome, but was changed forever by the incoming women. From these examples of aDNA analysis, it seems that there is considerable evidence for the migration of peoples at the transition from the Neolithic era to the Bronze Age. This seems to tie in nicely with the change in burial practices to the beaker burials. However, on further examination and refinement of data, archaeologists are now taking a cooler look at the interpretation and consider that, together with a considerable influx of peoples carrying an Eastern genetic trait, there was also a movement of ideas through neighbourly mixing. This more gradual assimilation of peoples and ideas would fit in with the fact that there is very little evidence for violence at this time, although plenty at other periods. I mentioned briefly a continuing source of debate, that of the spread of the near-continental culture once official Roman rule had ceased in Britain around 410 AD, a period known to historians as the Adventus Saxonum. Recently, there has been a flurry of activity using the modern techniques of aDNA and strontium and oxygen isotope analysis. The DNA gives inheritance data, as we've seen, while the isotopes from the teeth give data on where a person was born, lived at the age of 6 to 8 when the first permanent teeth come in, and then in adulthood. Ideal for tracing those who had made migration journeys. And that's how they'd done the isotope testing on the archer and his companion. Fortunately, there have been many excavations done over the years in the east of the country, which could now be sampled as part of a survey using the large numbers required for statistical analysis. They have also brought to light some fascinating genetic relationships in particular areas. During the 3rd and 4th centuries AD, there had been a worry about the peoples to the east of Britain, especially those in Denmark and the Saxon areas of the near continent. So a series of major forts were built to defend the east coast, what we call the forts of the Saxon shore. I remember going to see Birr Castle, and its remains are impressive to this day. Built in 3rd century AD, it would appear that it was abandoned militarily a century later. Perhaps the threat was perceived to have diminished. From later written evidence, it would seem that Saxon mercenaries were being recruited to bolster the Roman army. There was considerable unrest in mainland Europe at the time, and regular troops were being deployed on these fronts. Perhaps we learned to coexist more or less peacefully. There doesn't seem to be documentary or artifactual evidence to the contrary. One thing that has always puzzled me about this time is the rapid loss of a written language once Roman rule ceased, together with the lack of contemporary accounts of the post-Roman era, as literacy seems to have still been practiced in Wales along with Christianity. So let us look at a study using skeletons from previous excavations. The study that was done using old skeletons, so they had plenty of bones to work on, that's the point. And the study almost mirrors the forts of the Saxon shore in that it is in that eastern area of Europe. It consisted of 11 sites, many facing the North Sea, but moving towards the west at Worth Matravers in Dorset. There is a clear trend of migration coming from the near continent, both male and female, indicative of whole families being involved. Isotope analysis of teeth added a clear picture of migration over time, with people having CNE ancestry, but having their roots wholly in Britain, at least second or third generation migrants. So in the burial grounds, the graves that were sampled, the people that were sampled, and they are having relationships, mixing with the local people. Looking at the country as a whole, there are obviously a large number of migrants here by the 6th century, when Gildas was writing. Migration was fueled from the east of Europe, where plague was raging. I wonder how foreign these people were. After all, the people of pre-Roman Britain had a lot in common with Iron Age people on the continent. So the culture brought by the migrants may not have been so very alien. That the migrants took advantage of the unrest of the late 4th century in Britain, there can be no doubt. But stories of bloodthirsty rampages seem to be far from the truth. There's plenty of evidence for the invasion of the Roman army, however, and this was a sudden event. And the country then took on at least some of the attributes of Roman civilization in the years afterwards. Roman troops were sent to keep control. These were both legionaries and auxiliaries from many corners of the Roman world. When widening of the A14 in Cambridgeshire took place, a burial was excavated in a ditch at the side of the road. At first, this was thought to be a local man, but dating showed that he died in the 2nd century AD. So he was from the Roman occupation period. Ancient DNA showed an intriguing result, one headlined, more prosaically by the BBC, DNA sleuths solve the mystery of a 2,000-year-old corpse. The man was from Sarmatia, an area that is currently southern Russia, Armenia and Ukraine, between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. The Sarmatians were renowned for their horse riding skills, but they had suffered defeat by the Romans some time before. There are reports that Sarmatian auxiliaries were serving in Britain at the time, so the man could have been one of those, or a slave attached to him. The fact that he was buried without any personal possessions or memorial would seem to point to the latter explanation. Analysis of his teeth confirmed his origin. He had grown up eating a diet rich in millets and sorghum until the age of 6, but then his diet gradually changed to one based on wheat as he moved steadily westward throughout his life. So the scientific techniques are able to give voice to the incredible lives of ordinary people, who the histories have up to now largely ignored. The man would probably have walked or ridden, as he was a Sarmatian, the greater part of this journey, which shows the strength of the Roman logistics machine in enabling such controlled movement. The latest studies show that approximately 8% of the people in the Roman Empire died in a place remote from their origins. Many of these must not have reproduced in their final resting place, or all genetic signatures would soon have gradually disappeared. In case you're worried that I have forgotten about the role of Farnham in all this, I will bring the story closer to home. If you live in South Farnham and walk here, you will relish the weary plod back up the hill. You may notice a series of thankfully flatter sections along which the roads on either side run. What you are experiencing is a series of river terraces made by the River Wey, when it was in fact the Blackwater, when the river was wider than today. On the gravel terraces, early man made, and woman I suppose, made a series of remarkable stone tools, mainly hand axes. Interested locals started to collect these tools, which were found by workmen in the gravel pits, excavated when the hill was developed as housing in the early 20th century. Thanks to these collectors, Farnham Museum has a collection of national importance. The axes can be dated by the height of the terrace, the oldest at the Ridgeway, the youngest being next to the river at Snails Lynch. I recently had the pleasure of working with a group from Surrey Archaeological Society on recording and cataloguing these axes, so that the records can be published online for study by scholars in the field of Paleolithic peoples. These axes are chunky, well-formed, and used with the chopping movement. They're very tactile, they're lovely to hold. All the axes are Paleolithic, the Old Stone Age, some 200,000 years old, and are pre the last ice age. What has always puzzled me is where they lived. Paleolithic remains have been found in caves, but there are no caves on the Ridgeway or roundabout. A recent study from Africa may hold a clue. The discoveries of early hominins in Africa, particularly in the Rift Valley area. Indeed, it is safe to say that Paleolithic archaeology itself was born there. Recently, work has been done which has the potential to change the outlook on the lives of these early peoples. Whether wood or other organic materials survive depends on being left in anaerobic conditions, that is, undisturbed, wet, and excluding oxygen, conditions which are less frequently found. These pieces of wood were very chunky and had not only been worked into the required shape, but also were in positions that showed how they were meant to relate to each other. This caused considerable excitement and interest, as the pieces looked to have been used for construction purposes, so for huts, particularly when it was suspected that these pieces were of considerable age. Carbon-14 dating only works up to about 50,000 years ago, fine in normal circumstances, but of no use here. Much testing was done with the associated quartz in the sand and then with feldspar through a process called thermally transferred optically stimulated luminescence. I will not be going into that, which finally reached a date of 476,000 years, plus or minus 23,000 years. So roughly 500,000 years. If it is a construction, it is amazing. This is incredibly early, long before Homo sapiens. The manipulators of this would have been an early form of Homo, so Homo bodoensis or heidelbergensis. Whoever it was, it would seem from the variety of tools found at the site and from the fact that a simple form of worked digging stick, much used by people for a long time, was also found, that these people had a more settled life than the constantly moving hunter-gatherer life that we would originally have thought at that time. The stone axes from Farnham are dated about 200,000 years ago, before the last ice age, so the Neanderthals who created them may have found shelter in a wooden structure, just as their predecessors might in Africa. So those who live on the hill, look out for axes when you dig, and inspect very carefully any pieces of wood that you might excavate at depths. But what, I hear you ask, of the Black Death? So-called plague pits tend to haunt our minds, quicklime hastily shovelled onto those who died a horrible death. A study in Cambridge has been made of burial grounds across the city, the samples coming from a range of digs dating back to the 1970s. About 500 skeletons were analysed, researchers narrowing it down to focus on the most revealing remains that are representative of various social types. I don't know how they did that bit, but anyway. The team constructed osteobiographies of these people using the full range of modern techniques. Thus, the findings give a much more detailed picture of ordinary people's lives. One of the sites studied belonged to the Hospital of St. John the Evangelist. Founded in 1195, it lasted until 1511, when it was replaced by St. John's College. It helped the poor and infirm, its inmates being on average an inch shorter than townsfolk, to die younger and to show signs of TB. Although they were more likely to show signs of childhood hunger and disease, they were, however, less likely to have bodily trauma, suggesting life in the hospital carried less physical hardship or risk. Interestingly, researchers were able to identify some skeletons as early university scholars. Almost all townspeople have asymmetric arm bones, usually the right humerus being built more strongly than the left. 10 men from the hospital had symmetrical humeri, yet no signs of a poor upbringing. These men did not habitually do manual labour or craft, and they lived in good health with decent nutrition, normally to an old age. It seems likely that they were early scholars of the university. Less well-off scholars risked poverty once illness or infirmity took hold. As the university grew, more scholars would have ended up in hospital cemeteries. Despite the Black Death's fearsome reputation, killing maybe between 40 to 60% of the population in 1348-9, overall, the greatest threats to life in Western Europe were chronic infectious diseases such as TB and measles, whooping cough, and gastrointestinal infections. Before I finish, while reading for this talk, I came across an article about a new open-air archaeological museum in the Avalon Marshes in Somerset. Over 10 years and more, they've used volunteer labour to build buildings of differing ages, following as near as possible the results from several digs that took place in the locality. These look to be of good quality, a distinct improvement on the first Saxon replica huts at West Stowe that my husband was very sniffy about when they were first built. I feel that they will give life and immediacy to the majority of people who are not experts. Who knows if a youngster will be bitten by the bug for the past visiting such a place. So, in conclusion, what differences have scientific advances made to the study of the past? I would say that the contribution has been game-changing. To be able to discover details of the people whose skeletons we excavate has provided them with a biography, and I would say a sense of dignity and individuality that may have in the past been only known to those whose remains have documentation, such as the Egyptian pharaohs. Maybe the stories of human migrations and transfer of DNA and knowledge through them may make us more tolerant and understanding human beings. We can only hope so. Thank you.
This podcast has been produced by the Mr. T Podcast Studio in association with the Farnham U3A World History, Ancient, Medieval and Modern Group. Thank you very much for listening to this talk.